The galactic council chambers on Vorithis Prime were massive and built from crystalline materials that reflected light in thousands of colors. Representatives from 47 different species sat in their designated sections and discussed matters that affected trillions of lives across the galaxy. The humans had been members of the council for only 30 years, and most species still considered them newcomers who barely understood how galactic politics worked. Ambassador Gregory Palmer walked through the central aisle with measured steps. He was a man in his mid-50s with gray hair and a calm expression that never revealed what he was truly thinking. Behind him walked two aides who carried data crystals and diplomatic documents. The other species watched him with mild interest or complete indifference, because humanity was not considered important enough to warrant serious attention. The Zinthari representative stood from his seat, and his forearms gestured aggressively. Warlord Krethis was the military commander of the Zinthari Dominion, and he had been pushing for expansion into neutral territories for months. His species was tall and covered in dark scales, and their yellow eyes showed no mercy or compromise. He pointed one of his clawed fingers directly at Gregory Palmer. The warlord's voice boomed through the translation systems. The Zinthari Dominion had decided that 3 human colony worlds were now part of their territory. Humanity had 1 week to evacuate these worlds, or the Dominion would remove them by force. The colonies held over 15 million humans, and evacuating them in such a short time was impossible. This was not a negotiation, but a declaration of war disguised as an ultimatum. Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Viridian Chancellor made a token protest about proper procedures, but her voice lacked conviction. The Orpheus Collective representative stayed silent because they had trade agreements with the Zinthari that they did not want to jeopardize. Everyone expected humanity to either surrender the colonies or be crushed beneath Zinthari military might. Gregory Palmer reached the speaking platform and placed his hands on the smooth surface. He looked up at Warlord Krethis without any sign of fear or anger. His voice was quiet when he spoke, but the translation systems carried it clearly to every representative in the chamber. He thanked the warlord for making humanity's decision much easier. For 3 decades, humans had debated whether to reveal the truth about their presence in the galaxy. The Zinthari Dominion had just made that choice for them. The ambassador pulled a small data crystal from his pocket and inserted it into the platform's reader. The massive holographic displays that filled the center of the chamber flickered to life. Star charts appeared showing standard galactic mapping, but then Gregory entered a command and everything changed. New markers flooded the display in brilliant white. They showed human settlements and outposts scattered across regions of space that should have been unexplored. The timestamps on these locations made several representatives gasp. The newest marker was dated over 8,000 years ago. The oldest showed human presence in the galaxy from 12 millennia in the past. The Viridian Chancellor stood abruptly. She demanded to know if this was some kind of elaborate fraud because humanity had only achieved faster than light travel 70 years ago. Every species knew this because it was in all the official records. Gregory Palmer smiled and shook his head slowly. Humanity had lied. They had lied about when they developed FTL technology, and where they came from, and how long they had been exploring the stars. The truth was that humans had been traveling between worlds since before most council species had discovered fire. They had explored the galaxy while the Zinthari were still primitive hunters on their homeworld. They had built cities on distant planets while the Viridians were learning to forge metal. The holographic display shifted again. This time, it showed images of ancient structures on dozens of worlds. Massive spires that reached into the clouds and underground complexes that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Energy signatures from these ruins matched human technology. Archaeological dating confirmed they were thousands of years old. Some of the council members recognized these structures because they existed on their own worlds and had been attributed to unknown precursor civilizations. Warlord Krethis roared that this was impossible. His species had surveyed human space extensively and found nothing to suggest such advanced capability. Their ships were outdated, and their weapons were crude. Gregory Palmer nodded in agreement. Yes, the ships that humanity showed to the galaxy were outdated and crude. They were designed that way deliberately, to avoid drawing attention. The real human fleet had been sleeping for a very long time. The ambassador's wrist device chimed softly. He glanced at it, and his smile widened slightly. The signal had just been sent. Across human space, the ancient installations were receiving their activation codes. Systems that had been dormant for millennia were powering up. Crews that had been frozen in cryo-sleep were beginning to wake. The dreadnoughts that preceded civilizations were coming back online. Admiral Lisa Morgan stood on the bridge of the UHNS Valiant and watched her tactical display. She was a lean woman in her early 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. The Valiant was humanity's official flagship, and it looked impressive compared to the outdated vessels that made up the rest of the public human fleet. But Lisa knew it was a toy compared to what was waking up in the dark spaces beyond Neptune. Her communications officer confirmed that all 47 ancient facilities had received the signal. The awakening process would take approximately 6 hours. Lisa ordered the Valiant to begin moving toward the nearest human colony world. If the Zinthari decided to attack before the dreadnoughts were fully operational, then her ship would need to buy time. In the Kuiper Belt, far beyond the orbit of Neptune, there was a facility that had no name on any official charts. Commander Jack Hayes walked through corridors that had not felt the tread of boots in over 300 years. The lights came on automatically as he passed, and ancient systems hummed to life around him. He was a stocky man, with dark hair and eyes that had seen things most humans could never imagine. The facility was built into a massive asteroid that had been hollowed out and reinforced with materials stronger than anything the modern galaxy used. Inside the asteroid were docking bays large enough to hold vessels that dwarfed modern battleships. Jack reached the central control room and placed his hand on a scanner that read genetic markers unique to the ancient fleet command structure. Massive doors began to open in the side of the asteroid. Power cores that had been idle for centuries started their ignition sequences. In the cryo chambers below the control room, thousands of sleep pods began their thawing cycles. The crews of the ancient fleet had been waiting for this moment. Some of them had been asleep for 500 years. Others had gone into the ice over 1,000 years ago. Jack watched through the observation window as the first dreadnought began to move. The UHNS Eternity was a vessel 20 kilometers long and 5 kilometers wide. Its hull was the color of deep space and covered with weapons systems that made modern warships look like antiques. The ship's AI had maintained it perfectly during the long sleep. Not a single system showed any degradation. Across the solar system and in hidden facilities around other human colonies, the same scene was playing out. Dreadnoughts that had fought wars the galaxy had forgotten were waking from their slumber. The crews were ancient warriors from humanity's first expansion into the stars. They had faced threats that would drive modern species insane with fear. And now, they were being called to service once more. Back on Vorithis Prime, the council chamber had erupted into chaos. Representatives were shouting questions and accusations. The Zinthari delegation was demanding proof. The Viridian chancellor was calling for an immediate investigation. Through it all, Gregory Palmer stood calmly at the speaking platform and waited for the noise to die down. When silence finally returned, he spoke again. Humanity had kept these secrets for good reasons. The galaxy was young and fragile. The threats that the ancient fleet had been built to fight were gone now, eliminated in wars that lasted centuries. There had been no reason to frighten the younger species with tales of horrors from the dark. The dreadnoughts had been retired, and their crews put into peaceful sleep. But the Zinthari Dominion had made a choice. They had threatened human lives and demanded surrender. So humanity was making a choice too. The ancient fleet was being awakened. And if the Dominion wanted war, then they would learn what humanity was truly capable of when they stopped pretending to be weak. The cryopod hissed as warm air flooded the chamber and replaced the freezing mist that had preserved Captain Helen Torres for the last 500 years. Her eyes opened slowly and focused on the status display above her face. The readout showed her vital signs stabilizing and her body temperature rising to normal levels. She had gone into the ice in the year 2547, and now it was 3047. and the galaxy had changed in ways she could not yet imagine. Helen sat up slowly and let her enhanced muscles adjust to movement after centuries of stillness. She was a woman in her biological 40s, though she had lived for over 300 years when counting her active service time. Her dark hair was short and practical, and her brown eyes were already scanning the cryobay for potential threats. Old habits, from ancient wars, died hard. The bay was filled with rows of cryopods, and all of them were in various stages of thawing their occupants. Medical drones moved between the pods and monitored each person's revival. Helen saw her crew emerging from their long sleep and recognized faces she had not seen in half a millennium. These were veterans of the Shadow Wars. The conflicts that humanity had fought against enemies the modern galaxy had no knowledge of. End quote. Lieutenant Commander Paul Vincent appeared beside her pod. He was a tall man, with pale skin and blonde hair, who looked to be in his early 30s. Helen knew he was actually over 400 years old and had served with her through battles that had tested the limits of human courage and ingenuity. Paul offered her a hand and helped her step out of the pod. He briefed her quickly while medical drones scanned them both. The Galactic Council existed now, and humanity was a member species. They had been pretending to be a young civilization for 3 decades. A species called the Zinthari Dominion had threatened human colonies and forced the recall of the ancient fleet. All 47 dreadnoughts were being awakened simultaneously across human space. Helen nodded and asked about her ship. Paul smiled and told her the UHNS Eternity was in perfect condition. The AI had maintained every system flawlessly during the long sleep. They could be combat-ready within 4 hours. Helen's expression hardened. 4 hours was too long if humans were dying. She wanted the ship operational in 2 hours, and she did not care what corners they had to cut to make it happen. The Bridge of the Eternity was a vast space that could hold a crew of 500, though it only needed 50, to operate efficiently. Helen stood at the command platform and watched her officers take their stations. The holographic displays came online and showed her the state of the galaxy. So much had changed. New species had risen to prominence. Jump gate networks connected thousands of systems. Trade routes crisscrossed space in patterns that seemed chaotic to her ancient eyes. Her tactical officer was a young woman named Sophie Clark, who had only served 200 years before going into cryosleep. Sophie's fingers moved across her controls with practiced ease and brought up the weapons systems. The antimatter lances were charged and ready. The null field generators were operating at full capacity. The quantum displacement drive showed green across all readings. The Eternity was ready for war. Helen ordered a status report from all ancient fleet vessels. The responses came in quickly. The UHNS Harbinger, under Colonel Danny Foster, was already mobile. The UHNS Vengeance, commanded by Captain Ellen Wright, was running final system checks. The UHNS Sovereign, the UHNS Relentless, the UHNS Indomitable, and dozens more were reporting combat-ready status. Within 2 hours of waking from centuries of sleep, the ancient fleet was prepared to fight. Admiral Lisa Morgan's voice came through on the secure channel. She was coordinating from the UHNS Valiant and had overall command of the operation. Her orders were clear. The ancient fleet was to position itself in strategic locations throughout human space. They were to remain cloaked and invisible to all sensors. If the Zinthari attacked any human world, the response would be immediate and overwhelming. Helen acknowledged the orders and plotted a course for the outer colonies. The Eternity's quantum displacement drive activated without any of the dramatic light shows that normal FTL drives produced. The ship simply stopped being in one location and started being in another. To outside observers, it would appear that the massive vessel had vanished into thin air. Colonel Danny Foster stood on the bridge of the UHNS Harbinger and studied the tactical situation. He was a broad-shouldered man with cybernetic enhancements that were visible along his neck and hands. The augmentations were from an era when such technology was crude by modern standards, but vastly more powerful. His right eye glowed faintly blue when he accessed direct data feeds from the ship's systems. The Harbinger was the flagship of the ancient fleet and the most powerful vessel humanity had ever constructed. It had fought in the Battle of Kepler's Gate, where humanity stopped an invasion from beyond the galactic rim. Danny had been there. He had watched species that no longer existed die bravely to buy time for the human fleet to arrive. The enemy had been exterminated completely. Humanity had made sure that nothing remained to threaten the galaxy again. His first officer was a woman named Patricia Cole, who had served with him for over 600 years across multiple active duty cycles. She was reviewing intelligence reports on the Zinthari Dominion. Their military was large, but used conventional technology: plasma weapons, kinetic barriers, and standard FTL drives. Nothing that would pose a threat to ancient fleet vessels. Patricia remarked that it would be like bringing fusion bombs to a sword fight. Danny agreed but warned against overconfidence. The Zinthari had numbers on their side. Their fleet consisted of over 12,000 warships. Even with superior technology, the ancient fleet needed to be smart about engagement. He wanted to avoid casualties on both sides if possible. The goal was to make the Zinthari understand they had made a terrible mistake, not to commit genocide. In deep space beyond the established trade routes, the Zinthari were already moving. Warlord Krethus had not taken Ambassador Palmer's warnings seriously. He believed humans were bluffing with ancient ruins and fabricated data. His armada of 12,000 ships began assembling in preparation for the attack on human colonies. Scouts were sent ahead to probe human defenses and gather intelligence. The scouts never reported back. They vanished without sending any distress signals or emergency beacons. One moment, they were scanning a supposedly empty region of space, and the next moment, they simply ceased to exist. The Zinthari fleet commanders assumed equipment failures or natural phenomena. They did not consider that human ships were already watching them. Captain Helen Torres sat in her command chair and watched the Zinthari scout vessel approach her position. The Eternity was fully cloaked, and the enemy ship passed within 10 kilometers without detecting anything unusual. Sophie Clark had a weapons lock and could destroy the scout with a single thought. Helen shook her head. Let them pass. Killing scouts would only alert the main fleet. Better to let them waste time searching for ghosts. But when the scout began active scanning that could potentially penetrate their stealth field, Helen changed her mind. Sophie fired a single antimatter lance at minimal power. The beam crossed the distance in a microsecond and struck the scout ship's reactor. The vessel exploded silently in the vacuum of space. No wreckage remained larger than a few molecules. No evidence that would tell the Zinthari what had killed their people. Across human space, the same scene played out dozens of times. Zinthari scouts encountered ancient fleet vessels and died without ever knowing what killed them. The Dreadnoughts moved like predators through the darkness. Their quantum drives allowed them to appear anywhere without warning. Their stealth systems made them invisible to every known form of detection. Their weapons could reach out across distances that conventional ships considered safe. Commander Jack Hayes was coordinating logistics from the Kuiper Belt facility. More crew members were being awakened as needed. Supply ships were being loaded with antimatter fuel and exotic materials. The ancient fleet had been built with self-sufficiency in mind. They could operate for decades without resupply if necessary. But Jack wanted to make sure every vessel had full reserves before any major engagement. He received a report that made him pause. Deep space monitoring stations had detected unusual energy signatures near Zinthari space. The signatures matched weapons systems that humanity had not seen active in over 2,000 years. Someone else had ancient technology. Someone else had been hiding their true capabilities. Jack forwarded the information to Admiral Morgan with a priority flag. Lisa Morgan reviewed the data and felt a chill run down her spine. The energy signatures were not human in origin, but they were similar in power output. Some other species had technology that rivaled the ancient fleet. They had been hiding just as humanity had hidden. The question was whether they were friend or foe, and more importantly, whether they would reveal themselves now that humanity had shown its hand. She sent a coded message to all ancient fleet vessels. Remain vigilant for unknown contacts. Do not engage unless fired upon. The galaxy was revealing secrets that had been buried for millennia. Humanity was not the only ancient power that had been sleeping. And whatever else was out there had chosen this moment to wake up. Helen Torres received the warning and increased her sensor range. The Eternity's detection systems were far more advanced than anything the modern galaxy used. They could detect quantum fluctuations and dimensional distortions that normal sensors would miss. If something was hiding nearby, she would find it. The ancient fleet took up its positions and waited. The Zinthari armada was gathering strength. Unknown forces were moving in the darkness, and humanity stood ready to defend its people with weapons that had ended wars before the Galactic Council even existed. The peaceful decades were over. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you threatened those who remembered how to fight wars that made planets burn. Warlord Krethus stood in the command center of his flagship and watched the holographic display show his assembled armada. 12,000 warships filled the space around the staging area, in perfect formation. Each vessel was a masterpiece of Zinthari engineering, with plasma cannons and kinetic barriers that had crushed a dozen species into submission. The sight filled him with pride and absolute confidence that humanity would fall just as easily. His intelligence officers had found nothing to support the human claims of ancient technology. The archaeological sites showed old structures, but no weapons. The energy signatures detected in human space were minimal and consistent with civilian activity. The scouts that had gone missing were attributed to navigation errors or mechanical failures. Everything pointed to humanity, running an elaborate bluff. The warlord issued the attack order. The armada would jump to the human colony of New Haven and begin bombardment immediately. The colony held 3 million humans and minimal defensive capabilities. It would fall within hours. Once the humans saw their people dying, they would surrender the other colonies without resistance. Krethus smiled and showed all his teeth as the fleet began its jump sequence. In the depths of interstellar space between the staging area and New Haven, 6 massive shapes hung motionless in the darkness. The UHNS Eternity and 5 sister ships waited with perfect patience. Captain Helen Torres stood on her bridge and watched the Zinthari armada begin to materialize from jump space. 12,000 ships appeared in a cloud of exotic particles and immediately began forming attack formations. Helen opened a communication channel on all Zinthari military frequencies. Her face appeared on every ship's display, from the smallest scout to Krethus's flagship. She spoke clearly and without emotion. The Zinthari armada was ordered to turn back immediately. Any vessel that continued toward New Haven would be destroyed. This was the only warning they would receive. Warlord Krethus stared at the human woman on his screen and laughed. 6 human ships against 12,000 Zinthari warships. The ratio was 2,000 to 1. He told his weapons officers to target the human vessels and prepare to fire. Helen Torres sighed and closed the channel. She had given them a chance. What happened next was their own choice. The Eternity and her sister ships decloaked. The Zinthari sensors screamed warnings as vessels 20 kilometers long appeared from nowhere. But before the enemy could fully process what they were seeing, the ancient fleet attacked. It was not a battle. It was a lesson in how war was fought by those who had perfected it over millennia. The Dreadnoughts did not move the way ships were supposed to move. Their quantum displacement drives allowed them to flicker through space like ghosts. One moment, the Eternity was 10,000 kilometers away. The next moment, it was inside the Zinthari formation. Antimatter lances reached out and touched enemy vessels with beams of pure annihilation. Lieutenant Sophie Clark sat at her tactical station and coordinated the weapons fire with cold precision. She was young compared to most ancient fleet veterans, but she had been fighting since before the Zinthari discovered spaceflight. Her fingers moved across holographic controls, and each movement meant death for 3 or 4 enemy ships. The antimatter beams crossed impossible distances and erased matter from existence. The Zinthari tried to return fire. Plasma cannons launched bolts of superheated gas that could melt through modern armor. Kinetic weapons accelerated projectiles to relativistic speeds. Missiles with fusion warheads streaked toward the Dreadnoughts. None of it mattered. The null field generators created zones around each ancient fleet vessel, where conventional weapons simply stopped working. The plasma bolts entered the null field, and their energy dissipated into higher dimensions. The kinetic projectiles hit the field, and their momentum was shunted into quantum foam. The missiles detonated harmlessly as their warheads failed to achieve fusion inside the distorted physics of the null field. The Zinthari weapons might as well have been throwing rocks at mountains. Captain Ellen Wright commanded the UHNS Vengeance, and she specialized in precision strikes. Her ship flickered through the Zinthari formation and placed antimatter lances with surgical accuracy. She targeted engine blocks and weapons arrays. Enemy ships were disabled, rather than destroyed, when possible. Ellen had no desire to kill unnecessarily, but she would show no mercy to those who continued fighting. The Zinthari fleet began to break. Ship captains who had never experienced defeat suddenly found themselves helpless against an enemy they could not hurt. Some tried to flee. Others continued firing uselessly at the Dreadnoughts. A few brave commanders attempted ramming attacks, but the quantum drives allowed the ancient fleet vessels to simply not be where the Zinthari ships arrived. Warlord Krethus watched his fleet die and felt something he had never experienced before. Fear. Real and absolute fear. In 14 minutes, he had lost 4,000 ships. Not one human vessel showed even minimal damage. His weapons officers reported that their targeting systems could not maintain locks. The human ships moved in ways that violated the known laws of physics. He ordered a retreat. The remaining 8,000 Zinthari vessels broke formation and jumped away in every direction. The ancient fleet let them go. Helen Torres could have pursued and destroyed every single ship, but that was not the mission. The mission was to demonstrate that attacking humanity was suicide. That message had been delivered with brutal clarity. The battle had been broadcast across the galaxy through quantum relay stations. Every species with access to the communication network had watched the engagement in real time. The Galactic Council chambers on Vorithis Prime were filled with stunned silence. Representatives from 47 species had just witnessed technology that made their most advanced weapons look like primitive tools. The Viridian Chancellor stood on shaking legs and demanded an explanation. Ambassador Gregory Palmer was no longer on Vorithis Prime, but his message played on the main display. Humanity had tried to avoid this revelation. They had hoped to live peacefully among the younger species without frightening them, but the Zinthari had forced the issue. Now the galaxy would have to accept the truth. In the command center of the UHNS Harbinger, Colonel Danny Foster reviewed the battle recordings. His analysts were studying the Zinthari tactics and looking for any sign of competence or adaptability. The enemy had shown neither. They fought like species who had only known victory against weaker opponents. When faced with superior force, they had no strategy beyond retreat. Danny sent his analysis to Admiral Morgan, along with recommendations. The Zinthari would likely attempt one more attack to save face. They would use different tactics and try to exploit any perceived weakness. The ancient fleet needed to position vessels near major Zinthari military installations. When the next attack came, the response would be immediate, and even more devastating. Lisa Morgan sat in her command chair aboard the UHNS Valiant and felt the weight of command pressing down on her. She was coordinating a fleet that could destroy civilizations with ease. The responsibility was enormous. One wrong order could start a war that would see billions dead. She had to be perfect in her decisions, because the ancient fleet had no room for mistakes. Her communication officer reported incoming messages from dozens of council species. They all wanted to talk. They wanted explanations and assurances. They wanted to know if humanity intended to conquer the galaxy now that their power was revealed. Lisa ordered the messages archived for later review. Right now, her focus had to remain on the Zinthari threat. Captain Helen Torres brought the Eternity to a position near New Haven Colony. The civilian population had watched the battle through their observation posts. They knew how close they had come to bombardment and death. Helen sent a message to the colonial government. The ancient fleet would remain on station until the Zinthari threat was neutralized. No human world would fall while the Dreadnoughts stood guard. The colony administrator was a woman named Rachel Stone who thanked Helen with tears in her voice. 3 million people owed their lives to 6 ships that most of them had not known existed until an hour ago. Rachel asked how humanity had kept such powerful vessels secret for so long. Helen's reply was simple. Sometimes, the best way to protect people was to let them think they were safe. Fear of ancient weapons could be as destructive as the weapons themselves. In Zinthari space, Warlord Krethis was facing the fury of the Dominion Council. They had watched his armada be crushed like insects. 4,000 ships destroyed in 14 minutes. The military and economic cost was staggering. The political cost was even worse. The Zinthari had built their power on a reputation of invincibility. That reputation was now shattered. The Dominion Council demanded answers. How had human intelligence been so wrong? Why had the scouts reported nothing unusual? Who was responsible for this disaster? Krethis tried to deflect blame, but the recordings did not lie. He had ordered the attack after being warned. He had dismissed the human threat as a bluff. He had led their fleet into a massacre. But Krethis was not ready to accept defeat. He had one final weapon that the Council did not know about. Hidden in a classified research facility, the Zinthari had been developing a stellar converter. It was a device that could trigger a star to go supernova. The weapon was untested and dangerous, but Krethis no longer cared about caution. If he could destroy Earth itself, then humanity would know the price of humiliating the Zinthari Dominion. He diverted his flagship to the research facility and took personal command of the weapon. The scientists protested that it was not ready. The targeting systems were untested. The exotic particle beam could be unstable. Krethis silenced them with threats of execution. The weapon would fire its soul. Earth's sun would explode, and humanity would burn. Deep space monitoring stations detected the energy spike from the Zinthari research facility. Commander Jack Hayes saw the readings and understood immediately what was happening. He sent an emergency alert to all ancient fleet vessels. Priority 1 threat. Stellar converter weapon detected. Target designation Sol. Estimated time to impact 4 hours. The ancient fleet moved as one. Every dreadnought capable of intercepting the particle beam began calculating jump coordinates. The UHNS Harbinger was closest, and Colonel Danny Foster pushed his quantum drive to maximum output. His ship flickered across 3 light-years in seconds and positioned itself directly in the path of the exotic particle wave. Danny stood on his bridge and watched the stellar converter beam race toward his ship at faster-than-light speeds. The null-field generators were already at maximum power and expanding to encompass the entire particle wave. His crew worked with frantic efficiency to shunt the deadly energy into a pocket dimension where it could dissipate without harming anyone. The beam hit the null field, and reality screamed. Space itself distorted as incompatible physics collided. The Harbinger's generators strained under the load. Warning alarms blared across the bridge, but the field held. The exotic particles were redirected into higher dimensions and scattered across quantum foam. Earth was safe. Humanity was safe. And now the Zinthari had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session within hours of the attempted attack on Earth's sun. Every representative attended because this was no longer a matter of territorial disputes or trade negotiations. The Zinthari had tried to commit genocide on a scale that the galaxy had not seen in recorded history. 4 billion humans lived on Earth, and the warlord had tried to murder them all with a weapon that violated every treaty and convention. Ambassador Gregory Palmer walked into the chamber with Colonel Danny Foster at his side. The colonel wore the dress uniform of the ancient fleet, and it was covered with medals and ribbons that most species did not recognize. His cybernetic enhancements were clearly visible, and several representatives recoiled slightly at the sight. Ancient human augmentation technology had a reputation for being extremely effective and slightly disturbing to look at. They reached the central speaking platform, and Gregory activated the holographic displays. But before he could speak, The Viridian Chancellor demanded answers. She wanted to know why humanity had lied to the Council for 3 decades. She wanted to know what other secrets humans were hiding. She wanted to know if the ancient fleet intended to enforce its will on the galaxy now that its power was revealed. Gregory waited for the chamber to fall silent. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured. Humanity had not lied out of arrogance or a desire to manipulate. They had lied to protect the younger species from knowledge that could destroy them. The galaxy seemed peaceful now, but that peace had been bought with blood. Human blood. Spilled in wars that happened before the Council even existed. Colonel Foster stepped forward, and his enhanced voice carried easily through the chamber. He had fought in those ancient wars. He had seen things that would drive most species insane. He had watched entire civilizations consumed by threats from outside the galaxy, and he had helped humanity destroy those threats completely and utterly so that younger species could develop in safety. The holographic display changed to show images that made several representatives gasp. Massive mechanical swarms that blotted out stars. Beings of pure energy that fed on sentient thought. Reality-warping entities that turned entire planets into nightmares. Ships the size of moons that devoured everything in their path. These were the enemies that humanity had faced in the epochs before the Council existed. Dr. Karen Murphy appeared on the display from her office on Earth. She was humanity's chief xenohistorian and had spent decades studying the ancient conflicts. Her voice was steady as she explained what the galaxy had forgotten. 12,000 years ago, this region of space had been a war zone. Multiple aggressive species had been fighting for dominance. The conflicts had threatened to sterilize hundreds of systems. Humanity had been one of the few species with faster-than-light capability at that time. They had explored the galaxy and found it filled with violence. Rather than retreat to Earth, human leaders had made a choice. They would build a fleet powerful enough to end the wars. They would eliminate the threats, and they would create a safe galaxy where younger species could develop without fear. The ancient fleet had been the result. 47 dreadnoughts built with technology that pushed the boundaries of physics. Each ship carried enough firepower to crack planets. Each crew was trained to fight enemies that used weapons beyond normal comprehension. The fleet had taken 500 years to complete, and then humanity had gone to war. Karen activated historical recordings that the ancient fleet had preserved. The Battle of Kepler's Gate played out on the display. Waves of hostile entities pouring through a dimensional rift. Human ships forming a defensive line that held for 3 months of continuous combat. Danny Foster had been there. He had commanded a frigate that was long since destroyed. He had watched friends die to buy time for the dreadnoughts to arrive and seal the rift permanently. The Orpheus Collective representative asked the obvious question. If humanity had such power, why had they not simply conquered the galaxy themselves? Colonel Foster's laugh was bitter, because conquest was what the enemy had wanted. The ancient threats had been empires and swarms and collective consciousnesses. They had sought to dominate and consume. Humanity had fought to preserve freedom and diversity. Gregory Palmer took over the explanation. After the ancient wars ended, humanity had faced a choice. They could rule the galaxy as its protectors, or they could step back and let younger species develop naturally. The second option seemed better. So, the ancient fleet was retired. The crews went into cryosleep. The dreadnoughts were hidden away, and humanity deliberately slowed its own technological development. The Viridian Chancellor asked why. Gregory's answer was simple. Because a galaxy ruled by ancient humans would be a stagnant galaxy. Younger species needed room to grow and make their own mistakes. They needed to develop their own cultures and technologies. They needed to learn to solve their own problems. An overprotective parent, who solves every problem for their children, raises weak children. So, humanity had done something unprecedented. They had sabotaged their own progress. They had deleted records and destroyed facilities. They had split into isolated groups that developed independently. When they finally reunited as a unified species and rejoined galactic exploration, they pretended to be newcomers. They used outdated ships and limited technology to blend in with other young species. Commander Jack Hayes appeared on a secondary display from his facility in the Kuiper Belt. He explained the monitoring systems that humanity had maintained. Even while pretending to be weak, humans had kept watch over the galaxy. Deep space sensors tracked every major threat. If something dangerous emerged, the ancient fleet could be awakened. For 3,000 years, those sensors had detected nothing requiring intervention. Until now, the Zinthari Dominion had crossed lines that could not be ignored. Threatening colonies was one thing. Attempting to destroy an entire planet was another. The Stellar Converter attack had been an act of genocide. It had forced humanity to reveal itself and take action. The ancient fleet was awake now, and would remain so, until the threat was neutralized. Several council representatives protested. The Zinthari deserved punishment, but surely total war was unnecessary. Ambassador Palmer shook his head. This was not about punishment. This was about ensuring that no species ever attempted such an attack again. The galaxy needed to understand that certain weapons were forbidden. Certain actions would bring overwhelming retaliation. The Zinthari would serve as an example. A new voice spoke from the entrance to the chamber. Captain Helen Torres had arrived with a delegation from the UHNS Eternity. She walked to the platform with steady steps and stood beside Colonel Foster. The two ancient warriors looked at the assembled council, and the weight of their combined experience was almost palpable. Helen had fought in wars that the Viridian Chancellor's species had only just begun recording in their oral histories. Helen explained the reality of the Stellar Converter. The Zinthari weapon had been crude, but functional. If the ancient fleet had not intercepted it, Earth's sun would have gone nova. The shockwave would have sterilized every planet in the Sol system. 4 billion humans dead. Centuries of culture and history erased. And the Zinthari had fired that weapon, knowing exactly what would happen. The Orpheus Collective representative tried to argue that Warlord Crethus had acted alone. Helen cut him off sharply. The warlord had access to classified military facilities. He had diverted a flagship and its crew. He had fired a weapon that required authorization from multiple command levels. This was not one madman. This was a systemic failure of Zinthari leadership and accountability. Gregory Palmer brought up images of the jump gate network that connected the galaxy. Every species used these gates because they made FTL travel easy and efficient. What most species did not know was that the gates were based on human designs. Humanity had built the first network 12,000 years ago. When they retired the ancient fleet, they had left derelict ships containing gate technology where younger species would find them. The revelation sent another shockwave through the chamber. The technology that had allowed galactic civilization to flourish was human in origin. Every species owed their ability to easily traverse the stars to designs that humanity had deliberately shared. Gregory let the implications sink in before continuing. Humanity had not wanted credit or payment for the jump gates. They had simply wanted to help younger species develop faster. The gates were a gift from a civilization that remembered being alone in a hostile galaxy. But gifts did not create obligations. Humanity expected nothing in return, except that species would use the gates responsibly and peacefully. Dr. Murphy displayed archaeological evidence from dozens of worlds. The ancient ruins that were attributed to unknown precursor civilizations were all human in origin. Humanity had built cities on hundreds of planets during their first expansion. When they chose to step back, those cities were abandoned. Over millennia, they had fallen into ruin and been forgotten. Until now, the Viridian Chancellor sat down slowly. Her species had built their capital city on the ruins of an ancient structure they called the First Temple. It was the holiest site in Viridian culture, and it had been built by humans 8,000 years ago. The implications were staggering. How much of what the Council species believed about their own histories was wrong? Ambassador Palmer raised his hand for silence. The past was complex, and humanity did not claim to be perfect. Ancient humans had made mistakes. Some colonies had failed. Some experiments had gone wrong. Some conflicts had been handled poorly. But the fundamental truth remained. Humanity had fought to make the galaxy safe. And they had succeeded. Now the galaxy stood at a crossroads. The Xanthari threat had to be addressed. But more importantly, the Council had to decide how it would move forward knowing the truth. Would the younger species resent humanity for its ancient power? Would they demand that the ancient fleet be destroyed? Would they try to copy human technology and start an arms race? Colonel Foster spoke quietly, but every representative heard him clearly. The ancient fleet had no desire to rule. They wanted to go back to sleep, but they would remain awake until they were certain the galaxy was safe. If the Council could establish systems to prevent another Xanthari situation, then humanity would gladly return to hiding. If not, then the Dreadnoughts would stay active and enforce peace. The chamber erupted into debate. Some species demanded immediate disarmament of the ancient fleet. Others wanted to form an alliance with humanity. A few representatives suggested that all ancient technology should be shared equally. Gregory Palmer let them argue, while he and the other humans waited patiently. Eventually the Council would make a decision, and humanity would respond accordingly. Warlord Crethus stood in the command center of his flagship and stared at the tactical display with growing desperation. The stellar converter had failed. Earth still existed. The ancient fleet had intercepted his ultimate weapon and neutralized it as if swatting away an annoying insect. His last hope for salvaging Xanthari pride had evaporated like mist under a burning sun. The Dominion Council had issued an arrest warrant for him. The military commanders who had supported his aggressive expansion were now claiming they had been deceived. Everyone was scrambling to distance themselves from the disaster. Crethus was alone, and he knew his life was measured in hours. But he had one more card to play. In the cargo bay of his flagship was a fusion device large enough to sterilize a planet. If he could reach a major human colony before the ancient fleet caught him, he could detonate the device in orbit. Millions would die. It would not save the Xanthari or restore their reputation, but it would prove that they were not helpless. It would show that even the mighty ancient fleet could not protect everyone. His navigator plotted a course to the human colony of New Santiago. The planet held 12 million people and was lightly defended by modern standards. Crethus ordered maximum speed. His flagship jumped into FTL and raced toward its target. He did not notice the shadow that followed him through jump space. Captain Ellen Wright commanded the UHNS Vengeance, and she had been tracking Crethus since the stellar converter incident. Her orders were clear. Capture the warlord alive, if possible. Dead, if necessary. But under no circumstances allow him to harm another living being. Ellen watched her sensors as the Xanthari flagship emerged from jump space near New Santiago and began accelerating toward the planet. She did not hesitate. The Vengeance dropped cloak directly above the Xanthari vessel. One antimatter lance shot into the upper atmosphere of New Santiago and detonated with the force of a small sun. The explosion was visible from the planet's surface as a brilliant flash that lit up the daytime sky. But it caused no damage to the ground, because Ellen had calculated the detonation altitude with perfect precision. The message was unmistakable. The ancient fleet was here. They could destroy the planet if they wished. But they chose mercy instead. Crethus stared at the display and felt his last shred of courage crumble. His weapons officer reported that all systems were being jammed. His navigator said the jump drive would not activate. His ship was dead in space and completely helpless. Ellen's face appeared on every screen in the Xanthari flagship. She spoke in the warlord's own language with perfect pronunciation. Crethus was under arrest for attempted genocide and crimes against sentient life. He would surrender immediately and be taken into custody. Any resistance would result in his ship being destroyed. He had 10 seconds to decide. The warlord looked at his bridge crew. They were young officers who had followed his orders without question. They did not deserve to die for his mistakes. He stood slowly and raised all 4 of his arms in the Xanthari gesture of surrender. His crew followed suit. Ellen transmitted coordinates for a transport shuttle, and warned that any weapons fire would be met with instant annihilation. The transport arrived from New Santiago within the hour. Colonial security forces boarded the Zinthari flagship and took Crethus into custody. The warlord was placed in restraints and led to the shuttle while his crew watched in silence. As he passed through the airlock, he saw the UHNS Vengeance hanging in space above him. The dreadnought was so large it blotted out the stars. He had tried to fight gods and had learned the price of such hubris. The Galactic Council chamber was packed beyond capacity. Representatives from every member species attended, along with observers from dozens of unaligned civilizations. The trial of Warlord Crethus was being broadcast across the entire galaxy. This was not just about punishing one individual. This was about establishing precedent for how the most serious crimes would be handled. Ambassador Gregory Palmer sat in the human delegation section and watched the proceedings. The evidence against Crethus was overwhelming. The stellar converter attack had been recorded from multiple angles. The warlord's own crew had testified against him. Even the Zinthari Dominion had provided documentation, showing he had acted with full authorization from senior military commanders. The Viridian Chancellor served as chief judge because her species was considered the most neutral. She reviewed the evidence and consulted with legal experts from 15 different cultures. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was life imprisonment in a maximum security facility that would be jointly operated by the Council. The Zinthari Dominion agreed to pay reparations to humanity for the attempted attack, but the trial was only the beginning. The real work was happening in private negotiations between Council representatives and human officials. Admiral Lisa Morgan led the human delegation, and she brought Colonel Danny Foster and Captain Helen Torres as advisors. Together, they hammered out the framework for what would become the Galactic Defense Accord. The Accord established several key principles. First, weapons of mass destruction capable of sterilizing planets were banned completely. Any species found developing such weapons would face immediate sanctions. Second, the ancient fleet would serve as the enforcement arm for the most serious violations. Third, humanity would share limited technology to help Council species defend themselves against external threats. The Orpheus Collective representative asked what external threats humanity was worried about. Danny Foster pulled up the deep space monitoring data that Commander Jack Hayes had flagged weeks earlier. The unknown energy signatures were still there. They were moving slowly, but deliberately, toward Council space. Whatever they were powerful and potentially hostile. Dr. Karen Murphy presented her analysis of the signatures. They matched patterns from the ancient wars, but not exactly. Her best guess was that these were remnants of one of the civilizations that humanity thought they had eliminated completely. Somehow, a fragment had survived and rebuilt in the dark spaces between galaxies. Now they were returning. The revelation caused panic in the chamber. The Viridian Chancellor demanded to know why humanity had not mentioned this sooner. Gregory Palmer explained that until the signatures started moving, they could have been natural phenomena. Ancient fleet protocols required confirmed threats before raising alarms. Now the threat was confirmed, and humanity was prepared to deal with it. But this time they would not fight alone. The Galactic Defense Accord included provisions for joint operations between ancient fleet vessels and Council military forces. Humanity would provide advanced weapons and training. The younger species would contribute numbers and fresh tactical perspectives. Together, they would face whatever was coming from the dark. Captain Helen Torres returned to the UHNS Eternity and briefed her crew on the new situation. They were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were officially part of the galactic community now. It felt strange after millennia of secrecy. But Helen saw the wisdom in it. Fighting alone had been necessary when the younger species were too fragile to help. Now they were strong enough to contribute. Lieutenant Sophie Clark asked if humanity was making a mistake by sharing technology. What if the Council species used it against each other, or eventually against humanity itself? Helen considered the question carefully. It was a risk. But isolation was also a risk. The galaxy worked better when species cooperated. And besides, the technology being shared was centuries old by ancient fleet standards. On Earth, Commander Jack Hayes supervised the transfer of knowledge to Council research teams. They were being given the basics of null field generation and improved jump drive efficiency. The really advanced systems like quantum displacement drives and antimatter lances remained human secrets. But even the basic improvements would revolutionize galactic military capabilities. The Zinthari Dominion underwent massive reforms. The military commanders who had supported Krathus were removed from power. New leadership emerged that rejected the old expansionist policies. They approached Ambassador Palmer with a formal apology and a request to participate in the Galactic Defense Accord. Humanity accepted on the condition that Zinthari military strength be limited for a generation. Admiral Lisa Morgan moved her flag from the UHNS Valiant to the UHNS Harbinger. As the new Supreme Commander of Galactic Defense Forces, she needed a ship that could coordinate both ancient fleet vessels and Council warships. Danny Foster stepped down to become her deputy and chief tactical advisor. Together, they began organizing the combined fleet. The first joint training exercise was a disaster. Council ships could not keep up with ancient fleet maneuvers. Communication protocols were incompatible. Tactical doctrines clashed. Lisa spent weeks working out the problems. She assigned ancient fleet vessels to serve as command platforms for Council squadrons. Experienced human officers transferred to Council ships as advisors. Slowly, the combined fleet began to function as a coherent force. Captain Ellen Wright took command of the Rapid Response Group. Her ship and 5 other dreadnoughts would be positioned at strategic locations ready to jump to any threatened area within minutes. The Council provided support vessels and logistics. It was not as efficient as the ancient fleet operating alone, but it gave the younger species valuable experience. The unknown energy signatures continued approaching Council space. Long-range scans finally identified them as ships. Hundreds of ships using technology similar to the ancient threats. Dr. Murphy confirmed they were remnants of the collective consciousness, an entity that humanity had fought 3,000 years ago. Apparently, they had survived in dark space and spent millennia rebuilding. The Galactic Council mobilized every available warship. The combined fleet numbered over 50,000 vessels, including the 47 ancient fleet dreadnoughts. It was the largest military force the galaxy had ever assembled. They took up defensive positions along the projected invasion route and waited. Ambassador Palmer addressed the Council one final time before the battle. Humanity had hidden its strength to give younger species room to grow. That time was over. Now, they would face the darkness together. Whatever came from beyond the rim would find a united galaxy ready to defend itself. The age of secrets had ended. The age of cooperation had begun. Helen Torres stood on the bridge of the Eternity and watched the combined fleet on her displays. Ancient fleet dreadnoughts, mixed with Council cruisers and frigates. Zinthari ships flew alongside Viridian vessels. The Orpheus Collective contributed their advanced sensors. Dozens of other species provided what they could. It was chaotic and inefficient, and absolutely beautiful. The enemy fleet dropped out of FTL at the edge of Council space. They were massive biomechanical constructs that blurred the line between ship and creature. The collective consciousness had not forgotten humanity. Their first transmission was simple. They had returned to finish what was started 3 millennia ago. The galaxy would be absorbed. Resistance was futile. Lisa Morgan's response was equally simple. The galaxy had changed. Humanity was no longer alone. And the ancient fleet had learned new tricks in 3,000 years. She gave the order to engage, and the combined fleet surged forward. Antimatter lances from the dreadnoughts reached out first and carved holes in the enemy formation. Council ships followed through the gaps and engaged at closer range. The battle raged for 3 days. The collective consciousness was powerful, but it faced an enemy it had not expected. The younger species fought with desperate courage. The ancient fleet fought with cold precision. Together they pushed the invaders back. Helen Torres disabled enemy command ships. Ellen Wright protected council vessels from enemy fire. Danny Foster coordinated tactical strikes that shattered enemy formations. When it ended, the collective consciousness retreated back into dark space. They had lost over half their fleet. The combined galactic force had taken heavy casualties but held the line. More importantly, they had proven that cooperation worked. The ancient fleet alone could have won eventually, but fighting together sent a message. This galaxy was united. Any threat would face not just humanity, but all sentient species standing together. The victory celebration on Vorthis Prime lasted a week. Council species honored their dead and celebrated the living. The ancient fleet crews were treated as heroes. Captain Torres found it embarrassing. She had fought bigger battles with higher stakes, but she understood the symbolic importance. For the first time in galactic history, ancient and young had stood together. Admiral Morgan announced the permanent structure of the Galactic Defense Forces. The ancient fleet would rotate crews to avoid burnout. Half the Dreadnoughts would remain active at any time. The other half would return to sleep but with faster wake-up protocols. Council species would form the bulk of the defensive forces, with ancient fleet vessels serving as heavy support and rapid response. Ambassador Palmer retired from active diplomacy and took a position teaching galactic history at the new Unified Academy. Dr. Murphy joined him to run the xenoarchaeology program. Together, they would train the next generation to understand the truth about the galaxy's past. No more secrets. No more lies. Just knowledge, shared openly. Commander Jack Hayes finally left the Kuiper Belt facility and returned to Earth. His centuries of lonely vigil were over. The ancient fleet bases were being converted into joint training facilities. Human and council personnel would work side by side to prepare for future threats. Jack accepted a position as chief instructor and found he enjoyed teaching young officers from dozens of species. On a quiet evening months after the battle, Helen Torres sat in her quarters and wrote a report. Not for the council or the defense forces, but for herself. A record of how the galaxy had changed. She wrote about the fear she had felt waking from cryosleep, the uncertainty about revealing humanity's secrets, the pride, watching younger species fight bravely, and the hope that maybe this time peace would last. The ancient fleet had been built to fight alone in the darkness. Now they fought in the light surrounded by allies. It was different, sometimes frustrating, often inspiring, always worth it. The dreadnoughts that preceded civilizations had become the guardians that protected civilizations. And that, Helen decided, was exactly what they should have been all along.